On a cold October morning in 1917, a woman stood before a firing squad near Vincennes, France. Mata Hari faced execution as the most dangerous spy of the Great War, accused of selling military secrets that cost thousands of Allied lives. Her trial lasted mere hours. The evidence seemed damning. Yet, historians now recognize a troubling truth. She was likely innocent, a convenient scapegoat for catastrophic French military failures that demanded someone to blame. But while Mata Hari became history's most infamous spy, other women operated in the shadows with far greater effect. These operatives changed the course of the war through intelligence networks, coded messages, and calculated risks that remain largely forgotten. Louise de Bettigny ran a sophisticated spy operation from occupied France, reporting directly to French military command. Her intelligence shaped Allied strategy along the Western Front. Edith Cavell, a British nurse, coordinated escape networks while gathering battlefield information beneath the guise of medical work. Marthe Knockert, a Belgian nurse, documented German military movements from hospital wards, where wounded soldiers revealed tactical secrets. These women succeeded precisely because they were underestimated. Military establishments dismissed them as incidental to warfare, yet their work influenced battles, saved lives, and determined outcomes. They operated with no formal training, no institutional support, and no safety net. Capture meant execution. Their stories deserve telling, not as romantic legends, but as documented accounts of intelligence professionals who shaped history from the margins, operating in shadows where the stakes were absolute. The story of women who operated in the shadows of the First World War begins not with Mata Hari's final moments, but with the quiet realization that emerged across European intelligence services during those brutal years. Women could infiltrate spaces where men could not. They moved through society with freedoms their male counterparts lacked. They were underestimated, dismissed, and precisely because of this, extraordinarily dangerous. To understand how Mata Hari became the face of female espionage, we must first examine the landscape from which she emerged. The early 1900s presented a world in transition. Women had begun entering nursing, teaching, and diplomatic circles. They traveled between neutral countries. They attended salons where military officers relaxed their guard. They were quite simply everywhere that intelligence services needed to look, yet remained largely invisible as threats. Mata Hari was born Margaretha Gertruida Zelle in 1876 in Leeuwarden, Netherlands. She was Dutch, a fact that would prove both her greatest asset and eventually her undoing. Holland maintained official neutrality throughout the Great War, which meant Dutch citizens possessed unique access to territories controlled by both the Allies and the Central Powers. They could move across borders with relative freedom. They could travel to France, Belgium, Germany, and Spain without the restrictions placed upon citizens of belligerent nations. By 1900, Margaretha had reinvented herself as Mata Hari, a stage performer claiming Indian heritage and exotic mystique. She danced in Paris, in Berlin, in Madrid. She became a courtesan of extraordinary success, moving through the highest echelons of European society. Generals, diplomats, and wealthy industrialists became her lovers. She accumulated secrets the way others accumulated jewels. What began as opportunism evolved into something far more calculated. She discovered that information itself was currency, perhaps more valuable than the money her performances commanded. The outbreak of war in 1914 transformed everything. Suddenly, the secrets whispered in private chambers became matters of life and death. Military intelligence services across Europe recognized what Mata Hari had already understood. She possessed access that could be weaponized. The German intelligence service made contact with her first, identifying her as an asset who could operate across neutral territories. They assigned her the designation H-21 and tasked her with gathering intelligence from French military circles. The payments were substantial, the expectations clear, yet Mata Hari operated in a complex moral universe. She simultaneously accepted money and intelligence directives from the French intelligence service, specifically from Captain Georges Ladoux of the 12e Bureau. She collected intelligence from multiple nations while maintaining relationships with military officers from multiple sides. Whether she genuinely believed she served any single nation, or whether she simply pursued profit and survival remains contested among historians. The evidence suggests a woman of pragmatic amorality, playing multiple sides against each other, understanding perfectly well that in wartime, allegiance was a luxury only the dead could afford. This was the world into which other women emerged as intelligence operatives. While Mata Hari danced and seduced in the capitals of Europe, other women developed far more sophisticated intelligence networks. Louise de Bettigny, a Belgian woman of considerable education and linguistic ability, began her intelligence work in occupied Belgium. She understood that the German occupiers needed information about the civilian population, about resources, about morale. She positioned herself as a translator and liaison, gradually building networks of informants throughout the occupied territories. Unlike Mata Hari, de Bettigny's operated with calculated precision, creating formal intelligence structures rather than relying upon personal charm and sexual manipulation. Edith Cavell, a British nurse working in Belgium, discovered that her position in a hospital provided extraordinary intelligence-gathering opportunities. Soldiers recovering from wounds spoke freely to medical personnel. Information about unit movements, casualties, supply problems, and morale flowed naturally through hospital conversations. Cavell began documenting what she learned, passing information to British intelligence through carefully constructed channels. She maintained her nursing duties while simultaneously serving as an intelligence asset, her professional legitimacy providing perfect cover for intelligence activities. Marta Knockert, a Belgian nurse, followed similar paths. Working in field hospitals near the front lines, she observed military operations, unit compositions, and strategic movements. She recorded information about German forces while maintaining her primary work as a nurse. These women understood something that transcended the sensationalism surrounding Mata Hari. Intelligence work could be woven into legitimate professional roles. A nurse was expected to move through hospitals and collect information about patients. A translator naturally heard conversations in multiple languages. A woman of social standing moved easily through salons where officers gathered. Their professions provided perfect cover, camouflaging intelligence work within socially acceptable activities. The period from 1914 to 1917 witnessed the gradual professionalization of female intelligence operatives. What had begun as opportunistic use of women's social access evolved into systematic recruitment and training. Intelligence services recognized that women could access information sources that remained closed to men. They could establish relationships that men could not. They could operate in occupied territories without raising the same suspicions that surrounded male operatives. The British, French, and German intelligence services all developed female asset networks, though the extent and sophistication of these operations varied considerably. Yet this period also established dangerous precedents. Intelligence services that recruited women as operatives often viewed them as temporary assets, expendable elements of larger strategic operations. The same services that praised women's effectiveness during wartime would later deny knowledge of their work, abandon them when politically convenient, and in some cases prosecute them for the very activities they had been directed to undertake. The origins of female espionage in the 20th century were thus marked from the beginning by this fundamental contradiction. Women were simultaneously essential and disposable, celebrated and condemned, protected and betrayed. By 1917, as military stalemate ground on and casualties mounted into millions, the intelligence services grew increasingly desperate. They needed results. They needed scapegoats. They needed to demonstrate to their political masters that the war could still be won through superior intelligence. Into this atmosphere of desperation and frustration stepped Mata Hari, the most visible and vulnerable of all the women operating in the European intelligence networks. She had made enemies among military officers who questioned her loyalties. She had demanded money from multiple services. She had played her dangerous game too openly, too long. The moment of reckoning approached, though she did not yet realize how swiftly it would come. The year 1915 marked a subtle but irreversible shift in the landscape of European espionage. While Mata Hari continued her dangerous dance between intelligence services, other women were beginning to recognize that the war demanded sacrifices far beyond what traditional society expected of them. The battlefields of the Western Front had ground to a horrifying stalemate, and military commanders on all sides grew desperate for intelligence that might break the deadlock. In this crucible of need and necessity, women emerged not as accessories to espionage, but as its architects and essential operatives. Louise de Bettigny, a French aristocrat living in occupied northern France, became one of the war's most consequential intelligence assets. Operating from her home near the Belgian border, in an area controlled by German forces, she established what would become one of the most sophisticated spy networks of the entire conflict. Beginning in 1915, de Bettigny's recruited local contacts, cultivated relationships with German officers, and systematically gathered intelligence about troop movements, supply lines, and military preparations. Her network eventually encompassed more than 200 agents spread across the occupied territories. The information she provided proved invaluable to French military planners, offering detailed knowledge of German defensive positions and resource allocation that informed strategic decisions affecting hundreds of thousands of soldiers. What made de Bettigny's particularly effective was her understanding of human psychology and her ability to operate within the constraints of her gender. German officers, conditioned by social convention to view women as less threatening, spoke openly in her presence, about matters they would never discuss with male civilians. Her aristocratic status and apparent apolitical demeanor created a veneer of respectability that deflected suspicion. She cultivated relationships with German administrators, attended social gatherings where military personnel congregated, and maintained the appearance of a woman focused on the mundane concerns of daily life in occupied territory. Yet beneath this carefully constructed facade, she was conducting one of the war's most dangerous intelligence operations. Meanwhile, in Belgium, Edith Cavell operated under a different but equally perilous framework. The British-born nurse had established herself as the matron of a nursing institute in Brussels before the war began. When German forces occupied Belgium in 1914, Cavell faced a profound moral choice. She could have fled to neutral territory, as many other British nationals had done. Instead, she remained, convinced that her duty as a nurse transcended national boundaries. She continued her nursing work, treating wounded soldiers regardless of their uniform. But nursing, she discovered, provided the perfect cover for something far more consequential. Cavell became involved with an underground network dedicated to helping Allied soldiers escape from occupied Belgium. The network operated with meticulous care, moving escaped prisoners and stranded soldiers through a series of safe houses toward the Dutch border and neutral territory beyond. Cavell's nursing credentials and the Red Cross protection afforded to medical personnel made her an invaluable asset to this operation. She could move through occupied cities with relative freedom, could access hospitals and medical facilities where escaped soldiers might be hiding, and could use her professional authority to shield individuals under her care from German scrutiny. Between 1914 and 1915, the network she participated in facilitated the escape of more than 200 Allied soldiers. The risks Cavell accepted were not abstract or theoretical. German military law was explicit about the treatment of civilians engaged in assisting enemy soldiers. Helping prisoners escape was classified as a serious crime against the occupying power. Yet Cavell continued her work with full awareness of the consequences. Her diary entries from this period reveal a woman wrestling with the moral weight of her choices, understanding that her actions, if discovered, would result in her execution. She was not a soldier with the protections of uniform and rank. She was a civilian, subject to military justice in occupied territory, with no legal recourse and no possibility of prisoner exchange. Mata Hari's situation during this same period was becoming increasingly precarious, though she seemed largely unaware of the danger closing around her. Her financial situation had deteriorated significantly. The payments she received from her various intelligence handlers were insufficient to maintain the lavish lifestyle to which she had become accustomed. She began making desperate financial decisions, borrowing money from wealthy lovers and military officers, accumulating debts she could not repay. Her desperation made her reckless. She offered her services to multiple intelligence agencies simultaneously, sometimes providing the same information to competing services, extracting payment from each. The intercepted telegrams that would eventually seal her fate were being transmitted during this period. French military intelligence, using the code-breaking capabilities that had been developed at the Deuxième Bureau, began intercepting communications between German intelligence services and their operatives. These intercepts revealed that a German agent operating under the code designation Agent H21 had been providing military intelligence to Berlin. The French gradually became convinced that Mata Hari was this agent. The evidence, as historians analyzing the declassified documents would later note, was far less conclusive than French intelligence officials claimed at the time. Yet suspicion, once planted, grew into certainty in the minds of military officers desperate to identify the source of Allied intelligence failures. What the French intelligence services did not understand, and what recent scholarship has suggested, was that Mata Hari was likely being manipulated by multiple intelligence agencies simultaneously. German intelligence, recognizing her financial desperation, had paid her for information while deliberately feeding her false or misleading intelligence to pass on to French handlers. She was simultaneously deceiving the French, the Germans, and potentially the British and Russian services as well. She was not a master spy orchestrating a grand scheme, but rather a woman caught in a web of competing intelligence services, each using her for their own purposes, each viewing her as ultimately expendable. Marthe Knockert, a Belgian nurse, operated during this same period with a different philosophy and ultimately a different fate. Where Cavell was motivated by humanitarian principles and de Bettiniers by patriotic duty, Knockert was driven by a more complex mixture of motivations. She worked in a Belgian military hospital treating wounded soldiers, and through her position, she gathered intelligence about Belgian military capacity, German military movements, and the state of fortifications along the front lines. She had access to conversations between wounded officers, to medical records that revealed casualty figures and the severity of injuries, indicating the intensity of recent fighting, and to military personnel moving through the hospital. Knockert's intelligence work was never as extensive or as formally organized as de Bettigny's network, but it was consistent and strategically valuable. She was awarded the Iron Cross by German forces for her nursing work, an honor that seems contradictory until one understands that German intelligence was also cultivating her as a source. She was simultaneously being recruited and rewarded by multiple intelligence services, a situation that mirrored Mata Hari's entanglement, but with crucial differences in how she managed the relationships and the outcomes she achieved. The crisis that defined this period was not a single dramatic event, but rather the convergence of several catastrophic intelligence failures and successes. And on the German side, intelligence services were becoming increasingly concerned about the flow of information regarding their military dispositions and plans. They suspected a major leak but could not identify its source. On the Allied side, military commanders were growing desperate for reliable intelligence about German intentions and capabilities. The pressure from above was immense and unrelenting. The arrest of Mata Hari came on the 17th of February 1917 at the Hotel Élysée Palace in Paris. French military police, acting on orders from intelligence officials, took her into custody on charges of espionage. The arrest was swift and humiliating, conducted in a manner designed to prevent her from destroying documents or making contact with other intelligence handlers. She was interrogated extensively, and the interrogation sessions revealed the full scope of her deceptions and her simultaneous engagement with multiple intelligence agencies. What the interrogators discovered was both more complex and less dramatic than the grand conspiracy they had suspected. Mata Hari had indeed provided information to German intelligence handlers. She had also provided information to French handlers. She had taken money from both sides and had been largely unsuccessful at obtaining truly valuable intelligence from either. Most of the information she had provided was either already known to the intelligence services receiving it, or was false information deliberately fed to her by opposing services to test her reliability and to deceive her handlers. Yet, in the logic of wartime military justice, these nuances were irrelevant. The fact remained that she had accepted money from German intelligence. The fact remained that she had lied to French intelligence officials about her activities. The fact remained that military officers, desperate to explain intelligence failures that had cost thousands of lives, needed a scapegoat. Mata Hari, with her foreign origins, her lack of powerful protectors in the French military establishment, and her reputation as a woman of loose morals, was a perfect target. Meanwhile, Louise de Bettigny continued her intelligence work, unaware of how the arrest of Mata Hari was reshaping the landscape of espionage and how it would eventually affect her own position. The information she provided remained valuable and was treated as reliable by French military commanders. Edith Cavell continued assisting escaped soldiers through her underground network, believing that her work as a nurse would ultimately protect her from the worst consequences if discovered. Marta Knockert continued her dual role as nurse and intelligence asset, navigating the increasingly dangerous waters of occupied Belgium. The crisis point of this period was the recognition that women had become essential to the intelligence apparatus of the war, yet they remained legally and socially vulnerable in ways that male intelligence operatives did not. They could access spaces and information that men could not. They could use social convention and gender expectations as camouflage for their activities, yet they had no legal status as combatants, no protection under the laws of war, and no institutional support if their activities were discovered. They were simultaneously indispensable and entirely expendable. The trials and executions that would follow emerged directly from this crisis. The military establishments of Europe had become convinced that women spies represented an existential threat to their war efforts. The response would be swift, brutal, and designed to serve as a warning to any other woman who might consider engaging in intelligence work. Yet even as this crackdown began, other women continued their dangerous work, understanding the risks, but believing that their contributions to the war effort justified the dangers they faced. The morning of October 6, 1917, arrived with the indifference that only history can offer to human tragedy. Mata Hari sat in her cell at Saint-Lazare prison in Paris, her fate sealed by documents she may or may not have written, by allegations she may or may not have committed, by a war that needed scapegoats more than it needed truth. The Hotel Élysée Palace, where she had been arrested mere weeks earlier at coordinates 48.8708 degrees north and 2.3070 degrees east, had transformed from a place of comfort into the starting point of her descent. Now, as dawn broke over the Parisian skyline, she composed a final letter with the steady hand of someone who had already accepted what was coming. The trial that preceded her execution had been a masterclass in wartime hysteria masquerading as military justice. French intelligence officers presented intercepted telegrams, intercepted communications that seemed to implicate her in passing secrets to the Germans. They spoke of payments, of betrayals, of intelligence that cost Allied soldiers their lives. Yet the evidence, when examined by historians decades later, revealed a far more ambiguous picture. Pat Shipman, a biographer who would spend years analyzing the French and German intelligence files released posthumously, discovered that the documents used to convict Mata Hari were fragmentary, circumstantial, and open to interpretation. Some evidence suggests that she had been a double agent, playing multiple sides against each other. Other scholars debate whether she had ever truly betrayed anyone at all, or whether she had simply been a woman of loose morals in an age that could not tolerate such independence. The execution grounds near Vincennes, located at coordinates 48.8422 degrees north and 2.4241 degrees east, waited for her with the grim efficiency of military procedure. She was transported there in the pre-dawn darkness, her black coat pulled tight against the October chill. The soldiers assigned to the firing squad did not know her history, did not understand the currents of espionage and counter-espionage that had swept her into their crosshairs. To them, she was simply a woman to be executed, a sentence to be carried out, a duty to be fulfilled. But to the historians who would later examine the case, she would become something far more significant, a symbol of how women were used and discarded by the intelligence apparatus of the First World War, and how the same apparatus could destroy them when they were no longer useful. Yet the story of women in the shadows of the Great War cannot end with Mata Hari's death, for her fate represents only one narrative thread in a far more complex tapestry. While she faced the firing squad, other women continued their work in the intelligence services, some with greater success, some with less notoriety, all operating in the spaces between nations and the gaps in military security that women were uniquely positioned to exploit. Louise de Bettignier, whose intelligence network would prove far more consequential than Mata Hari's alleged activities, was living a very different reality in 1917. Based in occupied Belgium and northern France, de Bettigniers had established a network of informants and couriers that provided the Allied command with invaluable intelligence about German troop movements, supply lines, and military preparations. Where Mata Hari had operated through seduction and performance, de Bettigniers worked through meticulous organization and genuine patriotism. Her network, known as the Renseignements du Rhin, or Rhine Intelligence, employed more than 200 agents at its height. They gathered information through observation, through conversations with German soldiers who were quartered in occupied territories, through access to German administrative records and military communications. De Bettigniers herself was captured in 1915 but survived the war, eventually being recognized by the French government for her service. She would live until 1944, long enough to see the Second World War begin and to understand that her work in the first conflict had been merely the opening movement in a far longer symphony of espionage and warfare. The contrast between de Bettigniers and Mata Hari illuminates a fundamental truth about women in intelligence during the First World War. Women were effective not because they were inherently more deceptive or more cunning than men, but because the societies of the time systematically underestimated them. A woman could move through occupied territory with less suspicion than a man of military age. A woman could establish relationships with soldiers, officers, and administrators without triggering the same security concerns that would surround a male stranger. A woman could gather information through household tasks, through laundry work, through nursing duties, through the thousand small interactions that male spies would never have access to. The intelligence apparatus of the Great War discovered this advantage almost by accident and then proceeded to exploit it systematically. Edith Cavell, the British nurse whose arrest and execution in 1915 had shocked the world, represented yet another model of female intelligence work. Cavell ran an escape network from her nursing post in occupied Belgium, helping Allied soldiers evade capture and return to friendly lines. She was not primarily a spy in the traditional sense, gathering military secrets and passing them to intelligence handlers. Rather, she was a facilitator, a woman whose position and reputation provided cover for activities that would have been immediately suspicious if conducted by anyone else. When German military authorities discovered her activities and executed her by firing squad on October 12, 1915, they created a martyr whose death would be used in Allied propaganda for the remainder of the war. Cavell's final statement, reported in newspapers across the Allied world, emphasized her humanitarian motivation and her patriotic duty. Whether one views her as a nurse, a spy, a humanitarian, or a patriot depends largely on one's perspective, but all these characterizations contain elements of truth. Marta Knockert, the Belgian nurse spy, operated in a similarly ambiguous space between nursing and intelligence work. Knockert worked in a Belgian hospital during the German occupation, where she had access to wounded German soldiers and to information about German military operations. She was arrested, tried, and eventually released, surviving the war to write about her experiences. Her memoir, published after the armistice, provided one of the few first-person accounts of what it meant to be a woman conducting intelligence operations during the conflict. She described the constant tension between her duties as a nurse and her role as a spy, between her humanitarian instincts and her patriotic obligations. The choices she faced were not abstract moral dilemmas, but concrete daily decisions about what information to pass along, what conversations to report, what she could do to help her country without directly violating the laws of war. These women operated in different contexts, pursued different objectives, and achieved vastly different outcomes, yet they shared certain fundamental characteristics. All of them exploited the gendered assumptions of their societies, the ways that women were expected to be passive, observant, helpful, and non-threatening. All of them had access to spaces and information that male spies could not easily reach. All of them faced extraordinary risks, not just from enemy military forces, but from their own governments, which often disavowed them if they were captured or if their activities became politically inconvenient. And all of them, in different ways, paid a price for their service. The treatment of female intelligence agents by their own governments reveals a pattern that extends far beyond the First World War. Women were recruited because they were effective, but they were rarely rewarded in the same manner as male agents. They were often denied official recognition, their contributions written out of official histories, or minimized in the accounts that did acknowledge them. In some cases, like that of Mata Hari, they were scapegoated for failures that had nothing to do with their actual intelligence activities. The very characteristics that made them effective as spies, their ability to move through society without attracting suspicion, their access to intimate spaces and conversations, also made them vulnerable to exploitation and abandonment once their usefulness had ended. The trial of Mata Hari, when examined through the lens of historical documents held in French military archives, reveals this pattern with stark clarity. The evidence presented against her was thin, circumstantial, and in many cases contradicted by other intelligence assessments. Yet she was convicted and executed with remarkable speed, a speed that suggests that the French military command was less interested in determining the truth of her activities than in finding someone to blame for military setbacks that had multiple causes. The 2017 release of French dossiers, which had been sealed for a century, revealed possible innocence and extensive political scapegoating. Historians discovered that other officers, men with far greater access to military secrets, had engaged in similar activities with far less severe consequences. The difference was not the nature or extent of their crimes, but their gender and their political vulnerability. Yet to present Mata Hari solely as a victim would be to deny the complexity of her own agency and choices. She was not a woman forced into espionage against her will. She was a woman who made deliberate decisions to engage in intelligence work, knowing the risks, accepting the dangers, and believing that she could navigate between the various powers that sought to use her. Whether she ultimately betrayed the Allies, betrayed the Germans, or betrayed everyone equally remains a matter of scholarly debate. What is certain is that she was not the master spy of legend, the woman whose intelligence activities cost thousands of Allied lives. That narrative, constructed by French military officials seeking to explain military failures, has been substantially undermined by decades of historical research. The legacy of women in intelligence during the First World War extends far beyond the individual fates of Mata Hari, Louise de Bettignies, Edith Cavell, and Martha Knockert. These women demonstrated capabilities that intelligence services could not ignore. They showed that women could gather information, maintain networks, manage agents, and operate under conditions of extreme danger with effectiveness equal to or exceeding that of male operatives. Yet, this demonstration of capability did not immediately transform the intelligence services or society more broadly. Women continued to be systematically excluded from intelligence leadership, from formal recognition, and from the rewards and protections that male agents received. The German intelligence service, under the direction of officers like those who trained Mata Hari through the instruction of Elsbeth Schragmüller, known as Fräulein Doktor, recognized these realities and exploited them systematically. Schragmüller, who would become one of the most successful intelligence operators of the war, understood that women agents could accomplish missions that male agents could not. She recruited, trained, and deployed female agents throughout Western Europe, creating networks that gathered intelligence on Allied military operations, industrial production, and political intentions. Post-World War II German intelligence documents, uncovered and analyzed by historians decades after the conflict, revealed the sophistication of these operations and the central role that women played in them. The conclusion that emerges from examining the lives and fates of these women is not a simple one. Women were effective intelligence assets during the First World War because they occupied a unique position in the societies of the time. They were underestimated, given access to spaces and information that would have been denied to men, and capable of operating under conditions that would have drawn suspicion if a man attempted them. Yet, this effectiveness came at a cost. Women were exploited by intelligence services that saw them as expendable, were denied recognition and protection that male agents received, and were often scapegoated when intelligence operations failed. The treatment of Mata Hari represents an extreme case. But it is not fundamentally different in kind from the treatment of many other female agents who were used and discarded as circumstances changed. As we examine the artifacts preserved in institutions like the International Spy Museum, where an ornate bodice belonging to Mata Hari is displayed, we are confronted with the physical remnants of these stories. The intelligence documents, intercepted telegrams, and trial transcripts held in French military archives tell a more complete story than the legends that have accumulated around these women. The historians who have devoted themselves to studying these archives, analyzing the evidence with the rigor that contemporary accounts often lacked, have revealed a far more nuanced picture than popular culture has offered. The firing squad at Vincennes on that October morning in 1917 executed a woman whose actual intelligence activities remain ambiguous, whose true loyalties are still debated by scholars more than a century later, and whose death served purposes that had little to do with military necessity and much to do with political convenience. Yet, her execution did not erase the fact that women had proven themselves capable of conducting intelligence operations at the highest levels of complexity and danger. It did not undo the work of Louise de Bettigny and her network of 200 agents. It did not invalidate the contributions of Edith Cavell and Martha Knockert, and it did not prevent subsequent intelligence services from continuing to recruit, train, and deploy female agents in the decades that followed. The story of women who spied in the shadows of the First World War is ultimately a story about capability and exploitation, about patriotism and pragmatism, about the ways that societies use and discard people based on their utility rather than their worth. It is a story that did not end with the armistice of 1918, but rather continued through the Second World War and into the Cold War, as women continued to serve intelligence services with distinction, even as they continued to be denied full recognition and protection. The legacy of these women and the lessons their experiences offer remain relevant to anyone seeking to understand both the history of intelligence operations and the broader history of gender, power, and service in the modern world.